At 23,000 feet, the air is thin enough to kill a man in minutes, and the cold gets into the metal of the airplane until the control stick feels like a bar of ice through the glove. A pilot of the 100th Fighter Squadron sat in the cockpit of a P-51 Mustang with its tail painted solid red, staring east into a haze of flak smoke that hung over the biggest city in Germany. Below him and ahead of him were the bombers, box after box of B-17s, grinding toward Berlin. He had been in the air for hours. He was farther from home than any American fighter pilot in his Air Force had ever flown on a single mission. And somewhere out in front of that formation, coming fast, was a shape that should not have existed, an airplane with no propeller at all, trailing two thin ribbons of smoke, closing on the bombers at a speed no piston engine could match. It was March 24th, 1945. The airplane with no propeller was a Messerschmitt 262, the first operational jet fighter in the history of air combat, and it could fly 100 miles an hour faster than anything the Americans had. The men flying to meet it belonged to the 332nd Fighter Group of the United States Army Air Forces. Every pilot in that group was a black American, and the army they were fighting for had spent the better part of 2 decades insisting, in official documents, in the words of its own war college, that men like them could not do the very thing they were about to do over the capital of the Third Reich. I want you to hold both of those facts in your head at the same time, because that is the whole story. On one side, the fastest fighter in the world and the most heavily defended target in Europe. On the other, a group of men who had been told by their own country that they lacked the intelligence, the reflexes, and the courage to fly a fighter plane in combat. What happened over Berlin that day was not just a mission. It was an answer, and the answer was delivered at 400 miles an hour in front of the bomber crews whose lives depended on it. This is the story of that mission, and of the man who commanded the group that flew it, and of the lie that put them there. It is also the story of a myth that grew up around them afterward, a beautiful, comforting myth that I am going to take apart for you, because the truth underneath it is better than the myth, and these men earn the truth. Let me set the target first, because you cannot understand the risk without it. In the middle of March 1945, the war in Europe was clearly ending, but nobody in a cockpit could afford to believe that yet. The Allied armies were closing on the Rhine. In the east, the Soviets were driving on the German heartland, and the American strategic bombing forces were being used to hammer what was left of Germany's ability to build and fuel its war machine. There were 2 of those forces. The 8th Air Force flew out of England, the 15th Air Force flew out of Italy, up over the Alps, into southern Germany and Austria. The men with the red tails belonged to the 15th. On this day, the 15th Air Force was going to Berlin for the first time in its existence. That matters more than it sounds. Berlin sat at the far northern edge of what the Italian-based bombers could even reach. The target was a Daimler-Benz plant that assembled tank engines, and the raid was timed to support the great Allied crossing of the Rhine that was happening in those same days. Hit the German capital, force the Luftwaffe to defend it, pull attention, and fighters away from the ground armies pushing across the river. That was the logic. For the bomber crews, Berlin meant the longest, deepest, most dangerous penetration the 15th had ever attempted. For the fighter pilots who had to protect them, it meant flying to what the planners called the prudent limit of endurance, which is a polite way of saying you fly until your fuel gauges frighten you and then you fly a little farther. And it meant the near certainty of meeting the jets, because Berlin was where the Germans concentrated their new Messerschmitt 262s, and a jet that fast, thrown at a slow bomber formation, could open a slaughter in a matter of minutes if the escort failed. Now here is the part the maps and the mission folders do not show you. To understand why it was a black fighter group flying that escort, and why so much rode on how they flew it, you have to go back 20 years before Berlin to a document. In October of 1925, the United States Army War College, the institution that trained the Army's senior leaders, produced a study. Its title was The Use of Negro Manpower in War. It was written by white officers, drawing on the testimony of other white officers, and it reached conclusions that it presented as settled science. It said that the black American was, and I am quoting the language of the report here, very low in the scale of human evolution. It claimed his skull was smaller and his brain lighter than a white man's. It stated that he was by nature subservient, that he could not control himself in the face of danger the way a white man could, that he lacked initiative and resourcefulness, and, in one of the phrases that tells you everything about the mind that wrote it, that he was a rank coward in the dark. The historian Matthew Delmont, in his book Half American, lays out how a document like that does its work. It does not stay in a filing cabinet. It becomes the intellectual foundation for policy. And the policy it built was simple. Black Americans would be kept out of the Army Air Corps entirely because flying a fighter or a bomber demanded exactly the intelligence, judgment, and nerve the report insisted they did not have. For years, the reasoning ran in a perfect, airless circle. There were no black flying units, so there was no place to assign a black pilot, so there was no reason to train one, so there were no black flying units. By 1940, more than 100 African Americans held civilian pilots' licenses. The Army's answer was that this proved nothing. It took a lawsuit and pressure from the black press and the politics of an election year to crack that circle open. In 1941, the Army created its first black flying unit, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, and stood up a training program at Tuskegee, Alabama. Understand what that program was in the minds of many of the men who created it. It was not an opportunity, it was an experiment, and it was designed with the expectation that it would fail. Prove the report right. Wash the men out or send them into combat and watch them break, and close the whole question for another generation. The men who went to Tuskegee understood exactly what was being done to them, and into that understanding walked the man who would command them, a man whose entire life to that point had been a training course in institutional cruelty. His name was Benjamin Oliver Davis, Jr. His father was the first black general officer in the history of the United States Army. In 1932, the younger Davis entered the United States Military Academy at West Point, the only black cadet there, and what the other cadets did to him has a name. It was called silencing. For 4 years, not one of his fellow cadets spoke to him outside the strict line of official duty. He roomed alone. He ate alone. He was treated, deliberately and systematically, as though he did not exist, in the hope that he would quit. He wrote about it later in his autobiography, which he titled simply American. He said that what they did not realize was that he was stubborn enough to endure their treatment to reach the goal he had come to attain. 4 years of silence. He graduated in 1936, ranked 35th, in a class of 276. In my view, you cannot separate the commander the 332nd got from the 4 years of silence that made him. The Army had tried to break Benjamin Davis with isolation, and had produced instead a man of almost inhuman self-control. A man who had learned that the only answer to contempt was flawless performance that gave the contempt nothing to feed on. When he took command, he did not ask his pilots to be as good as white pilots. He demanded that they be visibly, measurably, undeniably better, because he understood, from the inside, that a black unit would never be graded on the same curve. That was the man now standing between those bomber crews and the jets. So the plan for Berlin had 2 layers, and I want to give you both. The tactical layer was straightforward on paper. The 5th Bombardment Wing, 6 groups of B-17s, would carry the bombs to the Daimler-Benz plant. Because everyone knew the jets would come, the 15th Air Force committed 5 of its 7 fighter groups to the escort, a heavy commitment. 4 of those groups flew P-51 Mustangs. 1 flew the twin-boomed P-38 Lightning. The escort was staged in relays, each group covering 1 leg of the enormous distance, handing the bombers off like a bucket brigade, because no single group had the fuel to cover the whole run to Berlin and back. The 332nd, the Red Tails, drew one of the deep legs, the penetration into the target area, exactly the stretch where the jets were most likely to strike. The other layer of the plan was the one no operations order mentioned. It was the layer Benjamin Davis had been drilling into his men since Italy. Stay with the bombers. There is a temptation for a fighter pilot that is almost impossible to resist. You see an enemy fighter, and every instinct in your body says, chase it, kill it, run up your personal score, become an ace, get your name in the paper back home. And every time a fighter pilot gives in to that temptation and goes charging off after a kill, he leaves a hole in the screen around the bombers, and through that hole other enemy fighters pour to butcher the men in the B-17s. Davis forbade it. His doctrine was that the mission was the bombers, not the glory. And a pilot who abandoned the bombers to chase a kill would answer to him personally. It cost his men individual fame. Not one Tuskegee pilot became an ace with 5 aerial victories, in part because of that discipline. It also kept bomber crews alive. Hold that trait in your mind. We are going to come back to it. If you're finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. And I will say this too. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for this one, and some of you have personal connections to this story. Fathers and grandfathers who flew or crewed or wrenched on airplanes in this war. I want to do it justice. Now, back to Berlin. The mission began, as all of them did, in the dark and the cold of southern Italy. The 332nd flew from a field called Ramitelli on the Adriatic coast. Ground crews had worked through the night, and here I want to stop on those men for a second, because they never get their due. The mechanics, the armorers, the men who bombed up and fueled and patched the Mustangs were also black Americans, held to the same suspicion and given the same contempt. And the combat record the pilots put up was impossible without the men who kept the airplanes flying. The pilots knew it. Davis knew it. When you picture the red tails, picture the flight line too. The Mustangs lifted off and climbed away to the north, formed up, and set course to rendezvous with the bombers over the Alps. This was the routine part, the long, droning, freezing haul that made up most of the reality of an escort mission, and none of the movies. Hours of it. The cold worked into everything. At altitude, the outside air temperature ran far below zero. Oxygen came through a rubber mask that could freeze up. The Mustang was a superb machine, the best long-range fighter of the war in my judgment, but it was a small, loud, cold, cramped place to spend the better part of a day, and the pilots flew it with their whole attention because a lapse meant a spin or a collision or a slow drift out of formation into the empty sky where the German fighters preferred to catch stragglers. They made the rendezvous. They took their bombers. And they settled into the grim work of close escort, weaving above and beside and behind the boxes of B-17s, throttling back to stay with the slower bombers, watching the sky in every direction at once. The bombers ground on toward Berlin. The flak began. Over a target like the German capital, the anti-aircraft fire was a physical wall, black puffs blooming by the hundreds, close enough to rock the airplanes and pepper them with fragments, and there was nothing a fighter pilot could do about flak except fly through it and hope. Some of the bombers were already taking hits, and then, out ahead, the escort saw what they had flown all this way expecting to see. The jets. The Messerschmitt 262 did not fly like anything the Americans were used to. It came in fast and flat, and it did not turn well, but it did not need to turn well. Its tactic against bombers was brutally simple. Use the enormous speed to slash straight through the escort screen before the propeller fighters could react, fire cannon into the bomber boxes, and be gone before anyone could bring guns to bear. A pilot in a Mustang trying to catch a 262 in level flight was in a losing race. The only way to kill one was to be in the right place at the right altitude at the exact moment it committed to its firing pass, and to have the nerve and the marksmanship to make a snapshot at a closing speed that gave you a fraction of a second. On March 24th, over Berlin, 3 pilots of the 332nd were in the right place and had the nerve and made the shot. The first was Charles Brantley. The second was Earl Lane. The third was a flight leader named Roscoe Brown. Each of them, in the swirling few minutes when the jets tore into the formation, put himself into a position to fire on a Messerschmitt 262, and each of them shot one down. 3 of the fastest aircraft on Earth, knocked out of the sky over the enemy capital, by pilots the United States Army War College had classified as lacking the reflexes to fly a first-class fighter. I want to be precise about Roscoe Brown because the histories sometimes overstate his moment and the truth is impressive enough without the inflation. Brown is often called the first American pilot to shoot down a jet, and that is not correct. American pilots, mostly in the 8th Air Force flying out of England, had been downing Messerschmitt 262s for months by that point. Even within the 15th Air Force, pilots of another group had scored against the jets earlier that same month. What is true and what stands is that Roscoe Brown was among the very first pilots of the 15th Air Force to kill a 262, that he did it over Berlin on the longest mission the force ever flew, and that he did it while doing his actual job, which was protecting the bombers. The honest version does not need the word first attached to it. 3 jet kills in one fight over that target by that group is a hard, real, remarkable thing. Now here is where a lesser telling would end, with the 3 jets falling and the music swelling. But that is not what the day was, because the jets were not the only German fighters up, and the escort was not a wall that nothing crossed. Some of the Messerschmitts got through, and bombers died. The 332nd itself paid. 5 of its Mustangs did not come home. One of them was flown by Captain Armour McDaniel, a squadron commander, who was shot down by enemy aircraft and taken prisoner. 4 others went down as well, young men named Leon Spears, James Mitchell, Ronald Reeves, and Robert Robinson. 5 red-tailed Mustangs, 5 pilots, gone from a single mission. That is what the escort cost the group on the day it earned its most famous victory. The 2 facts belong together. Anyone who tells you the story as a clean triumph is not telling you the story. And the bombers. Here we arrive at the hinge of the whole thing, the place where legend and evidence part company, so I'm going to walk it carefully. On that mission to Berlin, bombers of the 5th Wing were lost. Most of the losses came from flak, the anti-aircraft fire over the target, which no fighter escort on Earth could have prevented. But some bombers, on that day, were shot down by German fighters. The careful archival work puts the number at 3 B-17s lost to enemy aircraft, 2 of them from one bomb group and 1 from another. 3 bomber crews, 10 men each, brought down by the fighters. The escort was there to stop. I'm telling you that plainly because for decades the story was told a different way. The story was that the Tuskegee Airmen never lost a single bomber to enemy fighters in the entire war. Never lost a bomber. It became the one thing everybody knew about the Red Tails. It was printed in wartime magazines, repeated in books, carved into the legend, and it is, as a matter of documented fact, not true. The man who established that is a historian named Daniel Hallman at the Air Force Historical Research Agency, and I think his work is one of the most honorable things ever done in the service of these men's memory, precisely because on its surface it looks like it takes something away from them. Hallman did not rely on the legend. He went into the archives, into the daily mission reports of the 332nd, and cross-checked them against the mission reports of the bomb groups they escorted and against the missing aircrew reports filed when a bomber went down. And what he found was that on at least 7 separate missions, across the many escort missions the group flew for the 15th Air Force, bombers under the 332nd's protection were shot down by enemy aircraft. Across the whole war, the number of escorted bombers lost to enemy fighters was 27. Not 0. 27. Now, if I stopped there, you would think the legend had been destroyed. It is not. It has been replaced with something far more powerful. And here is why. Hallman did not just count the 332nd's losses. He counted everyone's. He asked how many bombers were lost to enemy fighters, on average, by each of the other 6 fighter escort groups in that same 15th Air Force, flying the same skies against the same enemy. The average for the other groups was 46 bombers lost. The Red Tails lost 27. The Tuskegee Airmen did not achieve the impossible. They achieved something real. They protected their bombers markedly better than the average American fighter group in their Air Force. They did it while flying under a scrutiny no white group ever faced, knowing that a single bad mission would be used to prove their whole race unfit. I think the true number is more moving than the myth ever was, and I will tell you exactly why. The myth of never losing a bomber is a myth of perfection, and perfection is not a human thing. It is a fairy tale, and fairy tales are easy to dismiss. 27 against an average of 46 is not a fairy tale. It is a record. It is the kind of thing you can put in front of the men who wrote that 1925 report and say, "Here, this is what your rank cowards did with an airplane." This is the initiative and the resourcefulness and the nerve you swore they did not have, measured against the performance of the men you did trust, and they beat them. You do not need the perfect version. The real version wins the argument. Let me give you the full weight of the numbers because this audience respects hard figures, and these deserve to be said out loud. Across the war, the airmen who trained at Tuskegee flew more than 15,000 combat sorties. They were credited with 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, and roughly 150 more destroyed on the ground. On one strafing run against enemy shipping, pilots of the group so badly hammered a former Italian destroyer that the Germans had taken over that they left the warship out of action for good, a fighter crippling a naval vessel with nothing but machine gun fire, which almost never happened in that war. They earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses. They earned 3 Distinguished Unit Citations, and one of those 3 was for the mission to Berlin on March 24th, 1945, the very fight we have been standing inside. And the cost of all of it, the price these men paid, was 66 of them killed in action, and another 32 shot down and taken prisoner. 992 pilots earned their wings at Tuskegee across the life of the program. Every number I just gave you was paid for by men who had to prove, first, that they deserved to be in the airplane at all. So who was responsible? In the architecture of a mission story, this is usually the moment where we ask who planned it and what they got wrong. But the planning of the Berlin mission was sound. The escort was heavy, the tactics were right, and the losses that came were the ordinary brutal arithmetic of attacking a defended target, not a blunder. The failure in this story is older and deeper than any operations order. The people who got it wrong were the ones who spent 20 years insisting these men could not do what they had just done. Go back to the 99th Fighter Squadron. the first of the Tuskegee units to see combat before the 332nd was even in the fight. It deployed to North Africa in the spring of 1943, flying P-40 Warhawks, and it flew its first combat mission on June 2, 1943, against a fortified island ahead of the invasion of Sicily. A month later, on July 2, 1943, a pilot named Charles Hall shot down a German fighter, the first aerial victory by an African-American pilot in the war. And then, that autumn, the institution moved to strangle the experiment in its cradle. The commander of the White Fighter Group the 99th was attached to, a colonel named William Mulmier, submitted an appraisal that said the squadron was not of the fighting caliber of any other squadron in his group. It went up the chain, and a general added a memorandum stating that the consensus of opinion was that the Negro type had not the proper reflexes to make a first-class fighter pilot, and recommending that the 99th be pulled from combat and that no larger black fighter group be sent overseas at all. That opinion was leaked to the press and printed in a national magazine. The 1925 report had grown teeth, and it was about to eat the whole program. What saved it was Benjamin Davis and evidence. Davis was called back to Washington, and he went before a War Department committee and defended his men with the cold, factual precision that 4 years of silence at West Point had forged in him. He did not plead. He presented performance. The historian Alan Gropman, in his study of how the Air Force eventually integrated, which he titled The Air Force Integrates, lays out how the Army then commissioned an actual statistical comparison of the 99th against comparable white squadrons flying the same airplane in the same theater. And the study found no meaningful difference. The squadron the consensus of opinion had condemned was performing exactly as well as the units it was being unfavorably compared to. I believe, reading Gropman, that this is the quiet hinge on which the whole Tuskegee story turned. Because if that review had gone the other way, the Red Tails never fly to Berlin at all. And then the men answered the report, the only way that ever really silences a thing like it in combat. In late January of 1944, over the beachhead at Anzio in Italy, where the Germans were throwing fighters at the invasion fleet, the 99th got its chance in a target-rich sky. Over roughly 2 days of hard fighting, the squadrons defending the beachhead claimed 32 German aircraft shot down, and of that total, the 99th's pilots claimed the highest number, 13. The squadron that the Army had nearly disbanded for supposedly lacking the reflexes to fight had just outshot everyone over one of the most contested patches of sky in the theater. The rank Coward in the Dark had a name, and it was painted on the side of a P-40 at Anzio. That is the responsibility, not a planner who sent bombers to the wrong target. A whole institution that looked at these men through the lens of a document written by people who had already decided the answer, and that had to be dragged by evidence and by blood and by the undeniable arithmetic of 27 against 46 into admitting it had been wrong for 20 years. Let me give you the operational detail because I know a large part of this audience flew or wrenched or has spent a lifetime reading about these airplanes, and you will want it right. And getting it right is exactly how you honor men whose whole struggle was to be judged accurately. The airmen did not fly the Mustang the whole war. Trace the machines with me in order because it tells its own story. The 99th started in combat on the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, a rugged, unglamorous fighter that was already being outclassed, and they flew it at Sicily and Anzio and made it work. When the 332nd came over as a full group, it flew first on the Bell P-39 Air Cobra, an airplane so limited at altitude that it was mostly good for low-level patrol work, which is the kind of unglamorous assignment a distrusted unit tends to get handed. Then in the spring of 1944, they moved up to the big Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the Razorback model, and it was on the Thunderbolt that the group first painted its tails that solid, unmistakable red. And finally, in the summer of 1944, they got the airplane they became famous in, the North American P-51 Mustang, first the Razorback B and C models, and later the bubble canopy P-51D. So if you ever see a picture that puts a red-tailed bubble canopy Mustang over Anzio in 1943, you are looking at a mistake because the timeline does not allow it, and this audience knows it does not. The markings matter too. On the Mustangs, the entire tail was red, and so was the spinner on the nose and a band just behind it. The wings carried the yellow identification bands the 15th Air Force used. The national insignia by that stage of the war was the star and bar with the blue border, adopted in the middle of 1944. So a red tail wearing the older insignia with no bars, or the short-lived version with the red surround, is wrong for the period. The 4 squadrons within the group carried their own small color codes on the trim, so that a man who knew what he was looking at could tell a 100th squadron airplane from a 301st. These are the details the men themselves cared about, and I put them in because a story that claims to respect these airmen and then flies the wrong airplane over the wrong beach has not respected them at all. And the phrase you will see painted on Davis's own Mustang, the words, "by request." The comfortable legend says the bomber crew specifically demanded the red tails over every other escort group, because the red tails never left them. It is a lovely story, and the documents do not really support it, because escort assignments were rotated by headquarters and the crews mostly flew with whoever they were given. The honest version is that the group's transfer to bomber escort duty came at the request of a senior commander who wanted more escorts, and that the Red Tails earned a genuine reputation among bombermen as a group that stayed with you. The reputation was real. It was earned in the air. It just did not take the shape of the fairy tale, and by now you know how I feel about trading the earned truth for the fairy tale. So let me tell you what I think this mission actually proved, and where it points. I think the deepest thing the record of these men exposes is how expensive prejudice is, not just morally, which is obvious, but practically in the hard currency of a war. For 20 years, the United States had, on paper, decided that a huge portion of its own population was unfit to fly. In a war that would ultimately be decided in large part by air power, that was not only a cruelty, it was a strategic act of self-harm. The talent was there the whole time. The men who would down jets over Berlin were alive and willing in 1925, and the institution spent 2 decades constructing reasons not to use them. J. Todd Moy, in his History of the Airmen, which he titled Freedom Flyers, makes the point that these men had to fight 2 wars at once, one against the Axis and one against their own country's assumptions. And I think the thing worth sitting with is that the second war was the harder one, because the enemy in it was wearing the same uniform. And here's the part where a lot of you are going to recognize something, because you have written to me about it in the comments for other videos. You have watched, in your own working lives, the person who actually understands the job get passed over, sidelined, doubted, held to a standard the favored people were never held to, while someone who managed upward and looked the part got the promotion. If you have seen that, you are not imagining it, and you already understand the machinery of this story in your gut. The pattern of competence buried by politics is older than any of us, and it runs through boardrooms and shop floors and squadron rooms alike. It just does not usually get this many people killed, and it does not usually leave a record this clean, this measurable, this impossible to argue with. 27 against 46. 13 of 32 over Anzio. 3 jets over Berlin. The favored opinion said one thing, and the flight logs said another, and the flight logs do not care about anybody's consensus. The record did not stay locked in the archives. It became an argument, and the argument won. When the fight over whether to integrate the whole American military came to a head after the war, the combat performance of the Tuskegee Airmen was one of the central pieces of evidence on the table, living proof that a segregated system was not just unjust but inefficient, that it was throwing away capability for no military reason at all. On July 26, 1948, President Harry Truman signed the executive order that mandated equality of treatment in the armed forces and set desegregation in motion. And the man who helped write the Air Force's plan to actually do it, who sat on the board that placed black officers into formerly all-white units, was Benjamin Davis, the cadet nobody would speak to for 4 years. The Air Force became the first of the services to integrate fully. Davis went on to become its first black general, and near the end of his life, a 4-star general. The army that had tried to erase him with silence made him, in the end, one of its own most senior officers, which is either the most American irony imaginable or simply justice arriving very late and very slow. I will leave you standing back up at 23,000 feet where we started, over Berlin, in the cold, with the flak blooming and the jets slashing in and the bombers grinding toward the target. Because that is where the whole 20-year argument was finally settled, not in a committee room or a report, but in the one place that could not be faked or leaked or spun, the sky over the enemy capital, with other men's lives in the balance. The War College had written that these men could not control themselves in the face of danger. On March 24th, 1945, in the most dangerous sky the 15th Air Force ever flew into, 3 of them lined up the fastest fighters on Earth and shot them down, and the rest of them stayed with the bombers, which is the harder and less glamorous and more disciplined thing, and it is the thing that kept other men alive. That is the answer to the report. It was always going to have to be given at altitude, because that was the only place the doubters could not look away from it. If your father or grandfather flew with the 332nd, or crewed one of the bombers the Red Tails escorted, or worked the flight line at Ramitelli, or turned wrenches at Tuskegee, I would like to hear about it. Those stories matter. This is exactly the kind of story where the men who were there see things the records never captured. Drop them in the comments. That's the story. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.